Now, as I said, he's long been interested in technology and in the sciences, and this began with chemistry lessons and electrical experiments performed in class while at Yale University under eminent scientific personages like Benjamin Silliman and Jeremiah Day. And some of this is, if you're really familiar with Morse stuff, some of this is going to be a little familiar to you, but I want to recap it briefly. And I'm sorry about the image of Day there on the right. That's actually from the Yale Gallery's website, so they don't have a good image either. So just so you know, it's as good as it gets apparently for Day. Historian Paul Israel has explained how invention and technology came to play an increasingly important role in American culture in the early 19th century, saying that by the late 18th century, when Morse was born, Americans were very ambivalent about technological process and change. But as the 19th century progressed, changing political and economic forces altered the agrarian society of Morse's youth into a newly formed industrial power, and Americans really began to embrace technology as a vital transformative agent. And Israel was writing mostly about Morse and the telegraph, but I think it's really essential for the daguerreotype as well. And historians of technology have I think, demonstrated this quite clearly. And as Morse's repeated inventive efforts prior to his work with the telegraph, they indicate his awareness of technology's cultural impact and how he really wants to be associated with this particularly American brand of modernity. So one of his first efforts, you can look at Morse while I talk about this, here, early self-portrait as a painter from the National Academy of Design. One of his first efforts in invention was his attempt to create a flexible piston pump with his brother. They wanted it to be profitable and also beneficial to the community, and they thought it could be cheap enough to be within the reach of everybody. He got endorsement from Silliman and Day. Cotton gin inventor Eli Whitney also voiced his approval of the machine. Unfortunately, it was a dismal failure. When the pump was mounted, it didn't produce any water. So Morse was pretty upset about that. He was frustrated, but he writes about this, and he says, "The machine business yields much vexation, labor, and expense, and no profit, yet I will not abandon it." However, he amends this promise to not abandon machinery with a really important caveat, saying, quote, "I will do as well as I can with it, but I will make it subservient to my painting." So we have machines and inventions subservient to painting. So here, as early as 1818, Morse is declaring his intention to somehow combine his interests in art and science and technology, but with an emphasis on the visual. And indeed, until he began working with the telegraph in 1832, the remainder of his experiments were all related directly to the mechanical reproduction of an existing subject. So the first of these took place in New Haven, and again, most of you are familiar with this, but I do want to recap them, with Silliman here on the left, where by 1820 he's there, he's with his wife, his baby daughter, he's in his parents' house. The house is very crowded, so he has a little painting studio and laboratory built for him outside of the house, and Silliman happens to be the Morse's next door neighbor. So during the summers of 18 and 20 and 21, Morse and Silliman get together, and they engage in various experiments, including what has been termed by photo historian Jeffrey Batchen as proto-photographic experiments, basically experimenting with the basic science that is photography before the 1839 announcements of Daguerre and Talbot's processes. He talks about this later in 1839, saying, maybe when he writes to his brother, saying, "You have perhaps heard of the daguerreotype, so called for the discoverer, Monsieur Daguerre. I don't know if you recollect some experiments of mine in New Haven many years ago when I had a painting room next to Professor Silliman's, experiments to ascertain if it were possible to fix the image of the camera obscura. I was able to produce different degrees of shade on paper dipped into a solution of nitrate of silver by means of different degrees of light, but finding that light produced dark and dark light, I presumed the production of a true image to be impractical and gave up the attempt." So he's basically describing the creation of a negative image, like other proto-photographers, Tom Wedgwood and Humphrey Davy, whose experiments he and Silliman were undoubtedly following because they both used nitrate of silver. Neither pair were able to create a positive image or to fix the image, that is, to stop it from developing. But another instance of his dedication, we'll go back to Morse for a moment, to mechanical reproduction is his attempt to create a marble carving machine for the replication of sculpture. So this is sometime in the spring or winter of 1823, and he hires a local mechanic, a fellow named Hezekiah Auger, to construct the design. And by December, his machine had produced a successful copy of the bust of some Apollo. We don't know which Apollo. But he soon discovers that a patent for a similar machine had been granted to somebody else, and so he abandons the project. So by 1823 here, there's some important precedents for Morse's work with the daguerreotype and also with the telegraph. In both of these instances, in the protophotographic experiments and in the sculpture replicating machine, he's attempting to copy an existing subject mechanically. Also in both, he's drawing upon the knowledge and skills of a partner with greater expertise than himself in a particular aspect of the invention. In the protophotographic work, he teams up with Benjamin Silliman, whose expertise in chemistry made him an ideal collaborator. In the case of the sculpture replicating device, he pairs with a mechanic to physically build his design. Now, this is a pattern he's going to repeat later with both his daguerreotype camera and with the prototype for the telegraph. And I think it's these kinds of exchange of knowledge that are going to become very crucial for the success of the daguerreotype, both for Morse and other early experimenters in a few years' time. So clearly, I think coming back to Morse and Draper a little bit more, I think we can clearly think that their later recollections that the partnership was conducted on this divide of art and science isn't strictly true, right? Because Morse has this long history of experimentation, so he clearly has some scientific and technological skill, but he's just also smart enough to pair up with someone who augmented the knowledge and skills he lacked. And even before he joined forces with Draper, Morse is seeking necessary assistance that he requires. This, by the way, it's not labeled, but it's the camera, the Morse camera that is here in the National Museum of American History's collection. So once Daguerre's manual arrives explaining the process, his manual explaining the process, arrived in the United States sometime in the mid-September of 1839, as Greg was just saying, and as we all know, Morse and many others began to experiment immediately. And Morse was, by all accounts, one of the first, with this whole other cast of characters, to successfully produce an image. Now, it seems likely that part of why he was able to create an image so quickly is that he was able to have this camera made very, very quickly, right away, as soon as he received his manual. His immersion within the realm of technology via the telegraph over the past several years had introduced him to a number of skilled mechanics. And using the same method that he employed when creating his machine for replicating sculpture many years prior, Morse hired a local mechanic. The same man who built the prototype for the telegraph, George W. Proch, to construct the actual device that he needed. Proch had a workshop in the basement of 142 Nassau Street in Manhattan, which was the same building that housed Sidney Morse's New York Observer. His brother Sidney Morse was the editor of this paper, the New York Observer, and where also Morse was living at the time. So he's right here in the same building. He's got a mechanic in the basement. He goes to him and says, "Hey, can you make this camera?" This fellow, Proch, was later called Morse's instrument maker, and Proch apparently later on went into daguerreotyping on his own. But it's this kind of collaboration between the mechanic Proch and the artist Morse that really helped early American daguerreotyping flourish. And Morse continued this trend when he paired up with Draper, of course, later on. But as I mentioned earlier, he first approaches Alexander Woollcott. So he's just trying to find somebody who can augment the skills he already have. Woollcott, said no and paired up with Johnson instead. Woollcott, though I'm sure seemed a logical choice because of the camera that we heard a lot about yesterday that he'd invented. He apparently used that camera to photograph a lot of these other early experimenters, all of whom seemed to gather at and around Chilton's chemistry shop, who was a chemist and a druggist who was supplying a lot of the chemicals to this New York band of experimenters, just in the same way a lot of the Philadelphia folks were congregating around McAllister's studio, his optician lens-making studio. So Woollcott, apparently took the photographs of a lot of these early fellows, including Morse. And I had to just show this image with the Woollcott because I figured this was the crowd who would appreciate it. This is the only image I've ever seen, and maybe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong or can point me to another one that would be fabulous, that we can relate to a Woollcott daguerreotype. This print is in the Library Company of Philadelphia's collections, and it's by John Sartain, but it's an engraving after a daguerreotype by Woollcott. And Sartain, of course, is a Philadelphia-based printmaker, and he's also, Kirk, as far as I've been able to tell, I think is a Philadelphia-based minister of some sort as well. So this is this other sort of link between Woollcott and this whole Philadelphia crowd. Anyway, we do know that's a tangent. I'll get back to Draper. So we do know that Woollcott was replaced by Draper with Morse. And we just heard a lot from Greg about Draper's proto-photographic experiments, what can also be classified as proto-photographic, though, as Greg also mentioned, I've never seen any account of him wanting to fix that image. As you said, so he watches them come and watches them go. Yeah, so slightly different in terms of what like Morrison and Silliman were doing, where they wanted to capture it, and a lot of the other proto-photographers. But because he's experimenting with the basic science, we can still label him as such. Draper was 28 years old when he was appointed to the university in 1839. He retained the position for the remainder of his life. And we don't know if Morse and Draper met just sort of generally at the university, if they get introduced because of they're both experimentation and photography. I mean, the university building at the time was not that large. It was just one building on the east side of Washington Square that I have an image of later. And as Greg showed us, here's this image again, this fabulous view of Broadway. Like Morse, Draper was able to take views of nearby buildings almost immediately. I think it's from, since you were asking about the date, I'm assuming it's from sort of the winter of 1839 into somewhere in the winter of 1840, somewhere between like December, March, in there, 39 to 40. From the cigar box camera with the spectacle lens. And he made those views apparently from the windows of his, of the east windows of the university chapel. And here is just a view of that university building, the sort of old Gothic building, which was torn down in, before the end of the 19th century was through. Now, this is where the pair had their daguerreotype studio. They put it on the roof of this building, of the university building, and that's why we have this view of the rooftop here. As we said, the partnership likely began in the spring of 1840, probably in late March or early April. They described the studio as, quote, a primitive gallery, which consisted of, quote, a turret room for a workshop and a hastily constructed shed with a glass roof that served for an operating room. And it was probably the second commercial portrait studio. Woollcott and Johnson opened theirs at least a month prior, in about February or so of 1840. Now, Woollcott and Johnson, intriguingly, had their portrait studio in a place called the Granite Building, which was on Chambers and Broadway, so quite a ways downtown from Morrison Draper's studio, which was on Washington Square Park. And the Granite Building, we know, was just lousy with artists. It was an artist studio building, amongst many other things. So that's something that I'm trying to sort of tease out as, I mean, I think they got it for the light as well, but what is the exchange going on between possibly Woollcott and Johnson in this Granite Building, which I'm sorry I don't have an image of, and these artists who may have been in the building? But Morse and Draper, they weren't daunted at all by their potential competition. They start taking portraits. They set up shop. They had some experience in taking daguerreotypes of living subjects, and I think intriguingly sent notices to the press around this time proclaiming their proficiency. So the article that Greg was showing us about Draper's portraiture that was published not until June at the London and Edinburgh Philosophical Magazine, and then in July in the American source, he actually wrote and sent that notice in March, in the spring of 1840, so right at the same time that he's opening his studio. And he says that he, quote, succeeded during the winter in procuring portraits by the daguerreotype. So it seems like the timing is very specific on the point of Draper, that, he's trying to say, okay, we're opening the studio and here, look, I already have proficiency, I have expertise in making daguerreotypes of living subjects, of living humans. And Morse does the exact same thing. In his brother Sidney's newspaper, the New York Observer, the notice comes in April. Quote, Professor Morse has succeeded in taking the miniature of his daughter by improving upon the discovery of Monsieur Daguerre. The picture is executed quite perfectly too, and as well delineated as the pictures of objects without life. Europeans have not succeeded in taking daguerreotype likenesses of persons.